Yesterday morning, the world woke to the shocking news that Shinzo Abe, Japan's former prime minister and the longest-serving prime minister in Japan's history, had been assassinated. And when you read the obituaries and the tributes to Prime Minister Abe that have been written in the past day, not surprisingly, they all outline the great things that he accomplished during his time in office. He was the first prime minister to visit Beijing in many years, which played an essential role towards warming the historically chilly relations between China and Japan. He took great strides to empower women in the Japanese workforce by drastically raising the proportion of women in management and leadership positions in Japan. And most significantly, he made sure to solidify Japan's position as a major international player by maintaining close ties with other world leaders all over the globe. And as part of that effort, by the way, in 2015, Shinzo Abe became the first Japanese prime minister to address the United States Congress. And what always strikes me when I read an obituary for a great leader like Prime Minister Abe is that the obituaries tend to focus not on what the leaders said, but rather on what they did. I didn't read anything about Prime Minister Abe's stirring speeches or his oratorical prowess. I read about the impact he made and the way that he conducted himself as a leader in the world. In his tribute to the Prime Minister, President Obama wrote very movingly about his friendship and his partnership with Prime Minister Abe, how they visited Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima together, and how he and his wife were so gracious and hospitable to the Obamas when they visited Japan. That's what people remember at the end of a great leader's life. Not what they said, but rather what they did. On June 29th, just a couple of weeks ago, we lost one of the modern giants of rabbinic scholarship when Professor and Rabbi David Weiss Halivni died at the age of 94. Professor Halivni taught Talmud and rabbinics at both the Jewish Theological Seminary and Columbia University for many years. And he developed a groundbreaking novel approach to the study of rabbinic texts, an approach which blends traditional methods of Talmud study with modern critical methods of Talmud study. And that approach continues to be highly influential among Talmud scholars today. But again, when I read through the many, many tributes that poured in about Professor Weiss Halivni over the past week or so, what stood out to me was not the emphasis on his scholarship, but rather the emphasis on his menschlichkeit nature. Not what he said, but the way in which he said it, the way in which he carried himself in the world. Professor Halivni was a legend who had the entire Talmud memorized, and he could famously give you the tractate and page number of any Talmudic passage much faster than a Google search. If you asked him to point out anywhere in the Talmud where any obscure passage was, he knew right away. And his level of prodigious knowledge sometimes understandably intimidated his students. But once they got to know him in the classroom, they discovered that he was anything but intimidating. He was supportive, he was loving, and most of all, he was a master teacher. One rabbi shared a memory this past week that he once had the audacity to raise his hand in class and ask Professor Halivni to define an Aramaic term that he had used repeatedly in their lecture that morning. And Professor Halivni turned to the class and asked, "Does everyone else here know what that Aramaic term means?" And they all nodded their heads, yes, of course we know what it means. And so one by one, he called on every student in the classroom and he asked them to define the term, and as it turns out, not a single student knew what that term meant. And of course, Professor Halivni knew that nobody knew what that term meant, but he was teaching his class a lesson that you should never be afraid to ask a question. That's the way he conducted himself as a teacher and as a rabbi, and that is what people are going to remember him for most of all. This week's Torah portion recounts the deaths of Moses' two siblings, Aaron and Miriam. And the truth is, Miriam is really overshadowed by the prominence of her two brothers. Aaron, of course, was the Cohen HaGadol. He was the high priest, the ritual leader of the people. And Moses was Moses. He was the spiritual leader of the people, the greatest of all prophets, the central figure of the Jewish story. And yet, despite not being as prominent as her brothers, the Torah tells us that when Miriam died, suddenly the Israelites' water all dried up. V'tamot sham Miriam v'tikaver sham v'lo haya mayim la'eda. And Miriam died and she was buried there, and the community was without water. And in the Talmud, Rabbi Yossi ben Rabbi Yehuda took note of this strange juxtaposition of Miriam's death with the Israelites' lack of water. And he taught that these two verses were placed next to one another very intentionally to teach us that due to Miriam's righteousness, her integrity, her compassion, a well of water sprung up and followed the Israelites around as they wandered through the wilderness. And that well was literally our ancestors' source of life. It sustained them for 40 years. But once Miriam died, the well dried up, and the Israelites had no choice but to find a new source of water. Moses and Aaron are remembered for their words. Aaron, of course, spoke words of bracha, words of blessing, in his capacity as high priest. And Moses literally spoke words of Torah as God's mouthpiece, God's human conduit to the people, God's lawgiver. But Miriam is remembered not so much for what she said, but rather for what she did. She watched over and protected an infant Moses as he floated down the Nile. She led the people in a rapturous song and celebration at the crossing of the sea, and her well sustained the Israelites and kept them alive during their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Miriam's life was not about the power of words, it was about the impact of deeds. She taught the Israelites how to sing in moments of joy, and she sustained them in their hour of greatest need. And that is how Miriam will be remembered. And when I meet a family in preparation for a funeral and they share their memories and their reflections of their loved one with me, they usually don't remember exactly what their mother or father said to them every night at the dinner table. They don't remember how often their parents actually said the words, "I love you." What they remember is the fact that they came to every Little League game, every dance recital, every school performance. They remembered how they stayed up with them while they were sick, or took them on family vacations, or walked them down the aisle at their wedding. As Miriam teaches us so powerfully in this week's parasha, at the end of our days, our lives are measured not in words, but in deeds. Abraham Joshua Heschel once wrote that it is in deeds that man becomes aware of what his life really means. His power to harm and to hurt, to wreck and to ruin, or to derive joy and bestow it upon others. The heart is revealed in deeds. And as we remember Shinzo Abe and Professor David Weiss Halivni and Miriam, let us all take Heschel's words to heart. Because it's not in our words, but our deeds, that we become truly aware of what our lives really mean. Amen. We continue now with